Hey guys, this is for the sophomores. I sent you a message a couple of days ago because I was concerned that the view count for our videos wasn't that great. I look at the analytics and I saw that a lot of you guys were not watching. So I checked. I checked a few hours ago. They went way up, so a lot more people are watching now. So thank you for that. I don't want to have to give a quiz or a test at this late date. But I really need you guys to watch these progressivism videos. So we have this one, and then we have one more, and then we are done. And then you were done with sophomore U.S. history. So make sure you watch this one from beginning to end, and then you watch the next one. And then if I see that you guys are watching, the analytics are good, then there'll be no need for any sort of test. So keep watching. Also, I got your papers, so hopefully everybody sent them to me, and hopefully you didn't use Google Drive either because that was giving me a whole lot of headaches as it always does. So thank you for that. Not using it. All right, so today we're going to talk about President Roosevelt leaving office. Remember, President Roosevelt is this iconic American leader, right? This larger than life personality, someone committed to using the presidency to advance progressive goals, enormously popular. And the thing is that Roosevelt had promised in 1904 when he had won that election, he said, I won't run again. This is my last term. And he just said it kind of in the heat of the moment in his excitement over his victory. But he regretted saying that. He regretted that for the rest of his life because he felt obligated in 1908 to leave office, to not run for another term because he had made that promise back in 1904. But in reality, Roosevelt spent the rest of his life trying to plot a way back. I don't mean plot in a pejorative, but really, well, sometimes, especially in those last few years of Roosevelt's life, where he was kind of the biggest warmonger trying to get us into the First World War. But he was determined to get back into the presidency. From the moment he left, he lived another 10 years and he spent all those 10 years trying to figure out a way to return. So he really regretted that promise that he had made back in 1904. But at least in 1908, he stuck with it. He did not run for another term. Now, Roosevelt, since he was leaving, though, he was determined to handpick a successor, someone that he felt would advance progressive priorities. And he asked his best friend, William Howard Taft, who had been serving as his Secretary of War, had been the governor of the Philippines. Philippines had just become an American colony back in 1902. And he was the first governor of the Philippines. But Taft had actually spent most of his career as a judge. Had a judicial temperament, like they used to say. Really had no interest in running for office. In fact, Taft had once said, "Politics, when I'm in it, it makes me sick." So he was not a natural candidate, but Roosevelt was determined to advance Taft, to get Taft to accept the 1908 Republican nomination. Taft's wife, Helen, was also determined to do the same. She really wanted to be first lady. So Taft really could not resist the pressure from Roosevelt, his BFF, and his wife, and ultimately he decided that he would run for the presidency in 1908, and won the nomination. And he faced two-time Democratic nominee William Jennings Bryan. Now, Bryan, remember, he was the Cross of Gold guy, the populist back in 1896. He had been this electric candidate that really kind of like, for a lot of people who are on the left, he just kind of mobilized and motivated so many of them back in 1896. He lost, then ran again, the nominee in 1900, and lost again. So he's back for a third run as president. Bryan just physically was very different from the man who had run for president 12 years earlier. Bryan had put on an enormous amount of weight. He had lost his hair. Also, he was much older. He was this youthful guy, 36 years old when he had run in 1896. Now he's pushing 50, heavy, bald, so not quite as mesmerizing a figure as maybe he had been back in 1896. Bryan, remember, was a big leftist, big populist, and he had actually argued that Roosevelt had stolen his ideas. that he had advanced way before Teddy Roosevelt had. Bryan wanted to expand on Roosevelt's legacy, though. He called for more rights for unions, for splitting up the monopolies, actually arguing, and I think correctly, that he was the natural heir to Teddy Roosevelt, even though Teddy Roosevelt was boosting Taft. And Taft, though, ran a very quiet campaign which relied almost entirely on having Teddy Roosevelt's endorsement, and it was enough. Taft won 53% of the vote to Bryan's 43%. It was a 10-point victory. He won 321 electoral votes to 162 for Bryan. So Bryan had improved on the Democratic performance of 4 years earlier when it was quite abysmal, but it was still a 10-point defeat. Now, Roosevelt cast a very, very long shadow. Even though Roosevelt was leaving office and we had a new president, Taft, in reality, Roosevelt in many ways thought he would still be pulling the strings, or at least he could kind of continue being president through Taft, if not directly, but then at least because Taft was kind of on the same page politically or ideologically with Teddy Roosevelt. Business groups and conservatives were really glad to see Teddy Roosevelt go. They kind of thought he was this dangerous, radical, unpredictable figure, and he, even though he really wasn't, he was a moderate progressive. But Roosevelt went on an African safari after leaving office, and one conservative senator said, "Let every lion do its duty." Figuring you could figure that one out. And the safari lasted over a year. And was kind of covered in the press quite heavily. So Roosevelt continued being in the headlines even after leaving office. So our new president, William Howard Taft, again, had spent most of his career as a judge. He's from Ohio. His lifelong goal was to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, not to be president. Eventually, after leaving the presidency, Taft did become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person to be both president and Chief Justice. And it was really in that role where Taft was happiest, because that's kind of where he saw his ambition lie, not like in elected office. Probably the one thing that people know about Taft, if they know anything about Taft, was his weight. He was morbidly obese. He was, what did I have to do that? No. He was 355 pounds. And, this kind of became like part of the, Taft legend. Probably the most famous story, which a lot of you guys probably heard, is that Taft in 1911 got stuck in the White House bathtub and actually had to be removed by Secret Service agents from the bathtub. You only imagine what that must be like. He's completely naked and he's being removed by Secret Service agents because he got stuck. Eventually, they installed a new bathtub in the White House that was the size that would fit 4 normal-sized people, to avoid another embarrassing incident like Taft had. So that's probably the thing that people most remember about him, is the fact he was so overweight. But Taft, even though he didn't want to be president, he did try to do his duties with diligence and integrity. In many ways, Taft actually continued Teddy Roosevelt's progressive agenda. He signed a bill giving the government the authority to regulate the telephone and the telegraph companies. Taft initiated 91 antitrust lawsuits. In fact, that's twice as many antitrust lawsuits as the trust buster himself, Teddy Roosevelt. And Taft was behind busting the 2 biggest trusts of the era, Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. So you could actually argue, at least in that regard, his progressive record was stronger than Roosevelt's. Roosevelt, though, took the breakup of U.S. Steel as a personal insult, because apparently he had given J.P. Morgan his word that he would never try to bust up U.S. Steel. And now Taft came in and he was busting up U.S. Steel, but Taft could say, well, you promised, I didn't. Now, Taft ultimately, though, spent most of his presidency consumed in a battle over control of the Republican Party between the progressives and progressives. This is left hand. Progressives and the conservatives. And Taft was kind of caught in the middle. Temperamentally, he sided more with the conservatives, even though Roosevelt thought he sided more with the conservatives than he actually did. He had some progressive tendencies, as did most politicians of this era. Or at least most successful politicians, because the times had changed and, we needed more government regulation of business. But he certainly wasn't a progressive like Roosevelt, or somebody even to the left of Roosevelt. He was definitely leaned a little conservative. The incident which really angered Teddy Roosevelt was something called the Ballinger-Pinchot affair in 1910. Richard Ballinger was the Secretary of the Interior, a conservative lawyer who favored development of the West, like drill, mine, cut trees, all of that stuff. And remember, from the last video, that had been Roosevelt's big issue, conservation. His good friend Gifford Pinchot was the head of the Forest Service, and Taft had actually kept him in his job. Now, Pinchot began criticizing Ballinger's policies. Ballinger was his boss as the Secretary of the Interior, and he was just Secretary of the Interior, and he's head of the U.S. Forest Service. And ultimately, Taft sided with Ballinger and fired Pinchot, which Roosevelt again took as a personal slight because Pinchot was a very good friend of his. Now, when Roosevelt returned from his African safari, he got a ticker tape parade in New York, like the Yankees get when they win the World Series. He was greeted as a conquering hero. And when he got back to the United States, he became more frustrated with the way Taft, remember his handpicked successor, was getting very frustrated with the way Taft was carrying out his duties as president, feeling that Taft was just too conservative. In the 1910 congressional elections, Taft tended to support conservative Republicans while Roosevelt favored more progressive Republicans. Now, Roosevelt's frustration with Taft was complex. One was just sheer ambition and jealousy. Roosevelt regretted having given the presidency to Taft. He wanted to be back in himself. He wanted to be president. So, in many ways, you could argue he was just trying to find any fault he could with Taft as an excuse to get back into the presidency. But that's a more cynical reason. But another reason why Roosevelt was probably, and it's something that needs to be explored more, I think, by historians. A bigger reason, I think, why Roosevelt became so frustrated with Taft, even though Taft was carrying out a lot of Roosevelt's policies, was that Roosevelt had become increasingly radical after he left the presidency. Roosevelt was embracing a far more left-wing progressive agenda than he ever had as president. He called for what he dubbed it the new nationalism, basically saying we have to have a sweeping expansion of the power of the federal government to regulate business, to bust trusts, or at least the bad trusts. He proposed old age insurance. He said we need national universal health care. Yes, he's saying this in 1911, 1912, and we're still fighting over this. So workmen's compensation, he backed women's suffrage. So Roosevelt had moved increasingly to the left after leaving the presidency. So that was a big reason why Roosevelt was just so angry with Taft, because maybe Taft was with the old Roosevelt, but Roosevelt had kind of evolved and kind of changed a lot of his views. Taft became increasingly identified with the conservative wing of the Republican Party, while Roosevelt began thinking, well, maybe I can have back in. Maybe I can run. I should run for president in 1912. And that's what Teddy Roosevelt decided to do. He decided to challenge his old friend, his best friend, I assume now ex-best friend, William Howard Taft, the man he had handpicked for the presidency. He challenged him for the Republican presidential nomination. Now, we talked about the motivations. Now, 1912 was the first election where we had presidential primaries at all. Remember, we talked about in another video, primaries had been a big progressive goal, that the people should pick the party's candidate as opposed to the political bosses. But at this time, only 11 states had primaries. So that means that was certainly nowhere near the majority. So that means the political bosses were still the ones who largely decided the presidential nominee. Teddy Roosevelt won 10 out of 11 primaries that he ran in. So clearly he was the choice of the average Republican. The rank and file Republican to be the nominee. And when the Republican convention began, Roosevelt actually was only 100 delegates short of winning the nomination outright, of actually defeating Taft. But political bosses, remember, they're the ones who still were the ones who were going to decide who the nominee was going to be. They did not trust Roosevelt. They thought he was unpredictable, as you can see. He picked this guy to be president. Now he's running against him. They felt he was way too radical in his views, and they preferred Taft, who was definitely would just kind of was more passive and also more conservative. And when the Roosevelt delegates arrived to the Republican convention, a lot of the Republican bosses said, "Oh, you don't count. You don't have the right to be delegates," which was a total power play, but a successful one that ultimately resulted in Taft winning the nomination over Teddy Roosevelt, even though Roosevelt had won 10 of the 11 primaries. Now, Roosevelt argued and believed that the nomination had just been stolen from him. So Roosevelt decided that he was going to bolt the Republican Party and form his own political party, his a third party called the Progressive Party. Um, and the thing is, literally, they held their convention only a week after the Republican convention. I don't know how they booked the hall that quickly. I usually have to book the prom a year in advance, but somehow they did. And the progressives, Roosevelt's people held this convention preparing to nominate him for the presidency under a third party banner. And the whole convention had the spirit of a religious revival. People who were into Roosevelt were so into Roosevelt and so into Roosevelt's ideals as well. Jane Addams, the famous progressive leader, the woman who had founded Hull House, advocate for progressive goals, actually officially nominated Roosevelt for president at the convention. One reporter, William Allen White, I don't think that name will mean anything to modern audiences, but he was probably one of the most famous journalists of the early 20th century. He covered the convention and he just got into it too. He actually joked, "Roosevelt bit me and I went mad," kind of like rabies. So it was this almost revival spirit in the convention. And Roosevelt, was given the nomination of this party that his people had created. And in his acceptance speech, he became, well, it was very messianic. He actually said in his convention speech, talking about the upcoming campaign, "I stand at Armageddon and I'm ready to battle for the Lord." So usually when people start talking like that, that's usually right? That's a little bit scary sometimes. But to his people, and I'll be honest, personally, if I was alive in 1912, I would have voted for Teddy Roosevelt, because Roosevelt actually ran on, as we talked about before, some of his ideals, an unbelievably powerful platform of progressivism, the new nationalism, a sweeping expansion of the power of the government to regulate business and also protect the people. Now, what made Roosevelt's views a little bit unique is Roosevelt believed in, from other progressives, is Roosevelt believed in big things. He was not against big business. Remember, he actually felt that some trusts actually should not be busted. So he was okay with big business as long as it was regulated by big government, and also that workers with big unions would have the power to check business. So he believed in big business checked by big government regulating them and big unions who would represent the workers' interests. So it was belief that corporations must be regulated, consumers and workers must be protected. It was an absolutely amazing platform, an agenda that unbelievably far-sighted too. Old age insurance, workmen's compensation, a minimum wage law, women's suffrage. It was a pretty bold platform. Some of it was really radical. He was actually saying that Supreme Court decisions should be able to be overturned by popular vote. Which really because Supreme Court back then was so conservative, that really angered Taft. Remember, had spent his life as a judge. He actually said when he heard this, he said of Rose, his old best friend, "I think of him now as a circus freak." Then Roosevelt called him fatso, and it got really really childish. But there were real differences. Taft was a regular conservative leaning Republican. Roosevelt was proposing something, and I'm not being dramatic, was proposing something along the lines of Bernie Sanders' platform when he was running in 1912. So this was a radical call for big government to regulate the excesses of American life. The term New Nationalism actually been coined by a man named Herbert Croly, who later founded the New Republic magazine. I'm a huge fan of Herbert Croly, and his vision, or at least what he saw as what the government should do in a changing society and actually making sure that people have basic protections from the excesses of big business. It was a very forward-thinking agenda that Crowley and then that Crowley introduced and then Roosevelt embraced in 1912. President Obama actually went to Osawatomie, Kansas, which is in 2010 on the 100th anniversary of when Roosevelt had gone there, and actually advocated a similar new nationalism, saying the government has to be more involved in actually regulating the excesses of business. Elizabeth Warren, I really feel, is a direct descent, well, descent is the wrong word, but her ideas are directly from the ideas that Teddy Roosevelt advocated in 1912. Structural change, not just like, oh, let's just give poor people money, but basically we have to change the way the government operates, and its relationship with the people. If we and the government's relationship with the people, if we really want to really improve things in the country. I've always been, just personal note, just very deeply inspired by the new nationalism ideas of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, the Democrats sensed victory, right? The Republicans were divided between Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. So with the Republican vote split, it was almost a guarantee the Democrats were going to win. The Democrats hadn't won a presidential election in a very long time. They had only won 2 presidential elections in the past 52 years. The Republicans always won elections, but they knew they were going to win this one. And they nominated for president the governor of New Jersey, a man named Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a very different kind of politician. Wilson had been the president. He was a professor, the only person to later become president who had a PhD, except for President Trump. No, just kidding. He was and then became the president of Princeton University. And from that position, he was elected governor of New Jersey, and he took on the political bosses in New Jersey, which actually earned him a really good reputation. And he ultimately defeated better-known names to actually win the Democratic nomination. Now, he ran on, his platform was the New Freedom, which actually was a contrast to the New Nationalism. Wilson believed that big business and big government were dangerous. So basically, the power of the government should be used to end trusts, to bust all trusts, not just the bad ones like Roosevelt believed, but because his vision was for small business to kind of be, ascendant, as opposed to these big businesses kind of controlling everything. So his vision was small businesses, and eventually that the government would split up the big businesses, and eventually the government itself could get smaller, and small businesses would thrive. It was kind of a progressive light, diet progressive agenda. Even though, as time went on, as president ultimately, Woodrow Wilson did embrace most of the conventional progressive agenda. Even though his ideas in 1912 were different than the regular progressive agenda. Roosevelt campaign quit pretty actively in the election. A horrible incident happened on October 14th, 1912, my birthday, not 1912, October 14th. And he was about ready to give a speech, and a man came up to him, an insane tavern keeper, came up to Roosevelt and shot Roosevelt in the chest. And the wound was quite serious. The only reason it didn't kill Roosevelt is Roosevelt actually had his eyeglass case and a doubled over copy of his speech, which was 50 pages, stuffed in his pocket, so that slowed down the path of his bullet. The eyeglass case and the speech rolled up. And even after, this tells you a lot about the kind of man Roosevelt was, even after being shot, Roosevelt then gave his speech for over an hour, even before he would go to the hospital. Which is unbelievable, right? But very typically Roosevelt. Roosevelt said ultimately when he was in the hospital for 8 days, and he said, "I feel as fit as a bull moose." And from that point on, his third party, the Progressive Party, became known as the Bull Moose Party. And this is an absolutely amazing story about Roosevelt. Wilson and Taft also stopped campaigning out of respect for Roosevelt's shooting. The man who shot Roosevelt actually said, "Well, I did it because the ghost of President William McKinley, came to me and said, 'You must kill my successor.'" Because remember, McKinley was shot himself. That's how Roosevelt became president back in 1901. But Roosevelt recovered, and ultimately in the election, Wilson predictably won because the Republican vote was split. Wilson got 41% of the vote. Roosevelt got 27% of the vote, which is the best performance ever by a third party in American history. Well, Taft got 23% of the vote, which is the worst performance by a major party in American history, and the worst performance by an incumbent president. Remember, he's the president; he's only getting 23% of the vote. The electoral margin 435 for Wilson. He won almost every state because the Republican vote was split. Remember, to 88 for Roosevelt to 8 for Taft. So it was a humiliating defeat for Taft, and also Roosevelt was not going to get his chance back into the White House. If he had been the Republican nominee, as he should have been, based on all the victories he had won in the 1912 primaries, Roosevelt would have been elected president for sure. But the one thing the 1912 election does show is just how far the nation had swung to the left. You don't hear that very often, right? Usually it's conservatives who, wind up winning in the end. Unfortunately in American history, if you're a progressive, you would think unfortunate. If you're conservative, you'd think great. But Roosevelt ran a very left-wing campaign. Wilson's running on progressivism. Taft, even though he's the most conservative candidate, but he also, remember, his administration actually had been quite progressive. And Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party candidate, usually socialists get like a couple of votes here and there. Debs got 6% of the vote in the 1912 election, which is also a really impressive performance for a socialist in the United States. So this country, 1912, was really now a progressive country that was committed to actually reining in the excesses of the Gilded Age. All right, guys, so we'll stop there. Again, I hope you've watched from start to finish. I tried to make this as interesting as possible. In our last video, we're going to be talking about Woodrow Wilson and how Wilson attempted to advance the progressive agenda during his administration. Also, I'll have some closing thoughts for you in our next video, our last video. Yeah, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.